I'm going to tell you something that happened in this town 22 years ago, and I want you to listen close because most folks who were there that day have either moved away, died, or convinced themselves they misremember what they saw. They don't misremember. They just don't like what it says about them. There was a woman standing in the middle of Redrock's Main Street with nowhere to go and no one standing with her, and the whole town, maybe 60, 70 people, pressing in from both sides like a river finding its banks. And she was the stone in the middle of that river, and she wasn't moving and she wasn't crying, and that scared them more than anything. And then a man came out of the mountains. And everything changed. I was there. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. And I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, without dressing it up and without leaving the ugly parts out. Because if I leave the ugly parts out, then the story doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean. So sit down, let me get my breath and listen. Set up. You have to understand what Redrock Gulch was like in those years, 1865, the summer after the war ended, to understand why that day happened at all. The war had been over for 3 months, maybe 4, but you wouldn't have known it from the way people were still carrying themselves. Men came back from Virginia and Tennessee and Georgia with that hollow look in their eyes, the kind of look that doesn't come from tiredness but from having seen too much and not being able to unsee it. Women had spent 3 years keeping households running on nothing and learning to make decisions without asking anyone's permission. And then the men came home, and everyone was supposed to go back to how it was, and nobody quite managed it. The town itself sat in a crook of Red Rock Canyon country in southern Colorado, elevation about 7,000 feet, where the air was thin enough that you noticed it the first few days, and then your body adjusted, and then you never thought about it again, until you went down to the flatlands and felt like you could breathe underwater. The main street ran east to west, maybe 300 yards of hard-packed dirt and loose gravel, with the general store on the north end, and the livery on the south, and the saloon in the middle, because that's where saloons always end up. There were maybe 200 people living in and around Redrock that summer. Half of them were miners who'd come up for the silver and stayed when they found copper instead, because copper still paid, and you'd already built your shack so you might as well. The other half were the settler families, the Hartleys and the Pullens and the Osborns and the Draytons, who'd come out before the war when the land was being parceled and had staked their ground and now considered themselves the backbone of the place. The mountains behind the town were serious mountains, not the pretty kind that painters come from back east to capture in watercolor. These were the kind that killed you if you didn't respect them: granite faces, pine forests thick enough to lose a horse in, ravines that you couldn't see the bottom of even on a clear day. In winter they were completely impassable. In summer they were merely dangerous. And in them, scattered across maybe 40 square miles of high country, there were maybe a dozen men who lived alone or nearly alone and came down into town 2, 3 times a year for supplies and to sell fur and to drink, and who otherwise wanted nothing to do with the rest of humanity. Folks called them mountain men, though some of them were barely 30, and the word men sometimes felt generous for what they were in terms of social development. They were self-sufficient and strange, and they smelled like pine sap and old leather, and they looked at you like they were deciding whether you were useful or not, and would move on quickly if you turned out not to be. One of them was named Harlan Cade. But I'll get to him. First, I have to tell you about the woman. Her name was Nora Vess, and she had come into Redrock 6 weeks before the day in question, arriving on the supply wagon from Pueblo with 3 carpet bags and a sewing kit, and a letter of introduction from the Methodist ministry in Denver that said she was a qualified schoolteacher seeking a posting, and that her character was above reproach. She was 26 years old. She was from Ohio originally, from a town called Millhaven near the river, where her father had been a clockmaker, and her mother had died of fever when Nora was 12. She had put herself through the normal school in Columbus by taking in mending and tutoring the merchant family's children on weekends, and she had gotten her certificate and spent 2 years teaching in a mining town in Nevada before that town dried up when the vein ran out. And then she had come east, or west, depending on how you looked at Colorado from Nevada, seeking a new post. She was not remarkable looking, or rather she was remarkable in the way that takes a moment to notice. Brown hair that she kept pinned but that had a tendency to escape at the temples, eyes that were gray in some lights and green in others. A particular way of holding her chin slightly up that some people read as pride and others read as stubbornness, and a few people read correctly as a woman who had learned early that you hold your head up or the world pushes it down for you. She was polite. She was quiet. She answered questions directly and didn't embroider her answers with pleasantries if she didn't feel them. This was mistaken by several people in Red Rock for coldness. The town council, which was really just Emmett Hartley and his brother Pierce and their friend Donovan Quill, who owned the general store, had agreed in the spring to seek a school teacher for the coming year. There were maybe 20 children of school age scattered across the valley and the canyon, and it had become difficult to pretend they were getting educated when the previous arrangement, which involved a retired miner named Sweeney who could read but was drunk most mornings by 10, had produced children who could write their names and not much else. Nora Vess arrived with her letter and her bags and was given a room above the dry goods store, which was cold in the morning and hot by noon, and she set about making herself useful. She organized the schoolroom, which was a converted storage shed behind the church. She assessed the children, who ranged from 6 to 14 and whose educational gaps were significant. She established a schedule. She wrote to Denver for books. For the first 2 weeks people liked her, or they said they did. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns often starts, with something small. It was the Hartley boy. Clemson Hartley, 12 years old, Emmett's eldest son. Smart kid, quick, but with the particular confidence of a boy who has grown up knowing his father is the most important man in town. He was used to being deferred to, not just by other children but by most adults who didn't want to cause friction with Emmett. Nora Vess did not defer to Clemson Hartley. What happened was this: Clemson had been copying another child's work. The other child was a girl named Bess Fremont, whose father ran the livery, and who was considerably smarter than Clemson and knew it, and had the good sense to keep that knowledge to herself most of the time. Clemson had copied Bess's arithmetic exercise and handed it in as his own, and Nora had noticed, because she was a good teacher and good teachers notice these things, and she had spoken to both children privately and then marked Clemson's work with a 0 and required him to redo it. Clemson told his father. Emmett Hartley came to the schoolroom the next morning with his hat in his hands but with his chest out, which is the posture of a man who has decided to be diplomatically aggressive, and he explained to Nora that Clemson was a bright boy, and this was clearly a misunderstanding, and perhaps the schoolteacher was still finding her footing, and he was sure it wouldn't happen again. Nora looked at Emmett Hartley for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Mr. Hartley, your son copied from another student's work. I handled it privately, which he did not deserve. If it happens again, I will handle it in front of the class. That is the policy and it applies to everyone." Emmett Hartley's face did something complicated. He put his hat back on and left without another word. And that was when the trouble really started. It's hard to explain, if you haven't lived in a small town, how fast a feeling can spread. Emmett Hartley didn't go around telling people he'd been told off by the schoolteacher. He didn't have to. His manner changed slightly toward Nora. The slight inclination of the head that passes for greeting became absent. The small courtesies that men of his station extend when they want to appear generous stopped appearing. And because Emmett Hartley was the largest landowner in the valley and had lent money to half the families in town at one point or another, his manner was noticed and it was calibrated against. Within 2 weeks there was a feeling. Nothing specific, no accusation. Just a feeling, spreading like dampness through timber, that maybe Nora Vess wasn't quite what she'd presented herself as. That she was a bit cold, wasn't she? A bit above herself. Had anyone actually written back to verify that letter from Denver? The Methodist ministry was a fine organization, certainly, but these things could be forged. And had anyone noticed the way she looked at things, at people, like she was taking stock rather than being friendly? And then, because a feeling that stays vague too long dies, and small-town grudges need feeding, the stories started. I want to be clear, they were not true. The first story was that she had been dismissed from her previous post in Nevada for inappropriate familiarity with one of the older students' fathers. Nobody could say where this story came from. It seemed to arrive from everywhere at once, the way rumors do when they're being carried on purpose, but by multiple people so that no single person can be blamed. The second story was that she wasn't actually a Methodist, that the letter was a fraud, and that she had some connection to the Mormon settlements out west that she wasn't disclosing. The third story, and this one did the most damage, and I think someone actually invented it with intent rather than just letting it grow, was that a child had come home from school with a bruise that Nora had caused. The child in question was 7 years old, a boy named Tommy Pullen, and his bruise was on his shin, and it had come from falling off a fence post at recess in the schoolyard, which 17 people had witnessed. Tommy's own mother said this. But Tommy's grandmother, who was old Mrs. Edna Pullen and who had the ear of half the women in town, said that she had heard otherwise, and when pressed could not say from whom she had heard it, and it didn't matter anyway because the story was already out. By mid-July, roughly 5 weeks after Nora Vess had arrived in Reed Rock Gulch, the temperature in town around her had changed completely. Women who had stopped to chat with her in the mornings now crossed the street. Men who had tipped their hats now looked past her. The town council met and discussed, without actually deciding anything, whether the arrangement with the new schoolteacher was working out. Through all of this, Nora Vess kept doing her job. She opened the schoolroom every morning. She taught arithmetic and reading and the basic elements of geography. She gave Tommy Pullen extra attention in his letters because he was struggling and she could see he was struggling and she cared that he was struggling, regardless of what his grandmother was saying about her across town. She ate her meals alone at the boarding house table. She wrote letters in the evenings. She held her chin up. I admired her for it. I told her so once. I was the deputy then, temporary, filling in for Marshal Breckenridge, who was recovering from a riding accident, and it was my job to at least appear neutral, but I'm not sure I managed it entirely. I stopped her one morning outside the dry goods store and said, quietly so no one would hear, "Miss Vess, I want you to know that I don't hold with any of this." She looked at me, those gray-green eyes, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Hatch, that means something." And then she went inside to buy thread, and I went back to the deputy's office, and I did not do nearly enough to stop what happened next. That failure is something I've carried a long time. The day it came to a head was a Tuesday. The 12th of August, 1865. I remember because I'd written the date in my notes that morning, force of habit from the Marshal job, and I've still got those notes in a box somewhere. The morning had been ordinary enough. Hot for August at that altitude, which surprised you if you just come up from the flatlands, but which the locals knew meant a storm was building somewhere behind the mountains. The sky was that particular blue that's almost white at the edges. The dust on the main street had a smell to it, dry and mineral, the way Colorado dust always smells. I was in the deputy's office going over some paperwork when I heard the noise. You can tell a lot from the quality of a crowd sound. There's the sound of people gathering around something interesting, which is a sort of excited murmur, people talking to each other and not quite focused. And there's the sound of people who are angry and moving with a purpose, which is lower and tighter and has a kind of rhythm to it, footsteps and voices pulling in the same direction. What I heard was the second kind. I went to the window. Nora Vess was standing in the middle of the main street. She had a basket over her arm. She'd been to the dry goods store, I thought, and she had stopped walking because she couldn't continue walking, because there were people in front of her. Emmett Hartley was there, Pierce Hartley, Donovan Quill. A man named Rufus Dane who owned a quarter share in one of the copper mines, and who had a reputation for getting to the front of things when things got ugly, because he liked the feeling of being in front. Behind them, spreading back along both sides of the street, maybe 40, 50 people. Not a mob exactly, not yet, but getting there. Getting there the way a river gets to flooding, gradually, and then all at once. I put my hat on and went out. By the time I got there, Emmett Hartley was talking. He had that particular voice he used for public occasions, deep and measured, the voice of a man who has decided he's speaking for everyone. "Miss Vess," he was saying, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about whether this arrangement is working." Nora stood there with her basket. "I'm on my way back from the store, Mr. Hartley. If you'd like to have a conversation, we can schedule one through the town council." "The town council is right here," Emmett said. Pierce and Quill nodded on cue. "3 of you isn't a full council," Nora said. Her voice was level, absolutely level. I don't know how she managed it. Rufus Dane said something from the back that I couldn't quite hear, but it got a murmur of support from the people around him. I pushed my way to the front. "All right," I said, "what's this about?" Emmett looked at me. He had the kind of face that never fully flushed with embarrassment because the skin was too weathered, but something moved around his eyes. "Deputy Hatch, we're addressing a town matter. This doesn't require your involvement." "Everything on the main street requires my involvement," I said. "That's the deputy's job." "Then stay and watch," Emmett said, and he turned back to Nora. He made his case. He was calm about it, which was actually worse than if he'd been shouting, because calm lies are harder to fight than angry ones. He talked about community trust. He talked about the children's welfare. He talked about how certain questions had arisen about Miss Vess's background and her suitability, and how it was the town's responsibility to take those questions seriously. He didn't name a single specific accusation. He was too smart for that. Nora answered each point. She was methodical. She offered the names of references in Nevada. She offered to write again to Denver and request verification of her letter directly. She said, very quietly, that she was aware of the story about Tommy Pullen's bruise and that it was false, and that she would welcome any direct inquiry from Tommy's mother, who she understood had already told people the truth. And I watched the crowd, and I saw something that made my stomach go cold. The crowd didn't care. Not about the truth, not about the logic. The crowd had come with a feeling, and the feeling wasn't interested in being argued out of existence. The crowd wanted what crowds have always wanted: resolution. Someone to agree with them, someone to move. And Nora Vess was not moving. I tried to say something. I think I said that this didn't seem right, that accusations should have evidence, that this wasn't the way a town handled things properly. And someone, I think it was a woman named Carla Osborne, whose husband had borrowed money from Emmett twice, said that maybe the deputy should consider whether he was still the right person for the job if he was going to take sides. The crowd murmured. And I want to tell you honestly, for a moment, a short moment, I considered stepping back. I didn't, but the moment was there, and I'm not proud of it. What I did instead was step up next to Nora, because it seemed like the least I could do, and I looked at Emmett Hartley and said, "You're going to need to bring this to a proper council session with proper notice. Whatever you think needs addressing, that's the way it gets addressed." Emmett looked at me like I was a slow child who had said something surprising. Then he nodded slowly and said, "Of course, we'll do it properly. And to Nora, you'll be expected to attend." "I'll attend," Nora said. The crowd didn't disperse so much as it absorbed back into the street, slowly, people drifting away in pairs and threes, talking quietly to each other. The feeling wasn't resolved. It was just postponed. Nora walked back toward the boarding house. I walked part of the way with her. "How bad is it?" she said. "Bad," I said. "I didn't see the point in lying." She nodded. She looked straight ahead. "They won't find anything to justify dismissing me." "They don't need to find anything," I said. "They just need enough people to agree that it's time for you to go. That's how it works here." She stopped walking. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I've done nothing wrong." "I know," I said. "That should matter." "It does," I said, "to me, and to some others, but not to everyone, and I'm sorry about that." She went inside. I stood on the street for a moment. The sky to the west had gone that odd yellowish color that means the storm is closer than you thought. I went back to the deputy's office and sat down and tried to figure out what I could actually do, and the answer I kept coming up with was not enough. The council session was scheduled for Friday. By Thursday evening, the feeling in town had intensified. I don't know exactly what happened between Tuesday afternoon and Thursday evening, but I think someone went around visiting, and the visiting had a shape to it, a direction. And by Thursday evening it was clear to me that the Friday session was not going to be a polite administrative proceeding. It was going to be something worse. I went to Nora that evening. I told her to stay inside Friday morning. I told her I'd speak at the session on her behalf, that I'd try to hold it to proper procedure, that there were a few people on the council who might listen to reason. She looked at me across the boarding house table. The lamp was low, and the room smelled like wood and wool, and the particular dry dust smell of high-altitude Colorado summers. "If I stay inside," she said, "they'll take it as admission." "If you come," I said, "I can't guarantee your safety." She looked at me steadily. "You couldn't guarantee it anyway." She was right. I went back to the office. I didn't sleep well. The storm that had been building finally broke around 3 in the morning. A hard mountain storm that threw rain sideways and knocked over the sign outside the barber shop. And by first light it had passed, and the air was washed clean, and the mountains were sharp against the sky like something cut from paper. And that morning, Friday morning, the 14th of August, was when the man came down from the mountains. I saw him come into town from the north end of the street, where the canyon road comes down and levels out into the valley floor. He was walking, which was unusual for men coming down from the high country, who usually rode or came by mule because the road was long and the altitude was punishing. But he was walking, with a pack on his back that was sized for a man who expects to need everything he's carrying and has packed accordingly. He wore canvas trousers, heavy worn boots, a flannel shirt that had seen better years, and a coat that might have started its life as something elegant but was now patched at both elbows and the collar, and had lost its buttons on the left side and been replaced with bone toggles. He was tall, not the theatrical tall of a man who's been described too many times, but genuinely tall, 6'2", 6'3", with the particular build that comes from years of carrying heavy things across steep terrain, which is thick through the shoulders and chest but lean everywhere else, nothing spare, nothing wasted. He had a beard that was neither trimmed nor wild, just the beard of a man who didn't think about it much, and his hair was roughly the same dark brown as his coat. He had a rifle across his back on a sling, which was not unusual for men coming out of the high country. His name, as I said, was Harlan Cade. I knew him slightly. He'd been coming down to Reed Rock 2 or 3 times a year for about 5 years, long enough that I recognized him, short enough that I didn't know him. He spoke little when he was in town. Bought his supplies from Quill's store, flour, salt, shot, a few other things, sold his fur to the tanner, had a drink or two at the saloon, sometimes spent a night, more often didn't. He had a manner that was not unfriendly, but was very specifically uninviting. The manner of a man who is fine with your existence, but would prefer it to remain at arm's length. I tried to talk to him once, a couple years back, just out of the normal social impulse of a small town. Asked him where he was camped up in the mountains, how the trapping had been that season. He'd answered in complete sentences, which some of those men didn't bother with, but the answers had been short and had not produced further questions, and I'd understood that the conversation was one-directional and had let it go. I didn't know much about where he'd come from before the mountains. Somewhere east, he had an eastern accent, Pennsylvania or thereabouts, mostly worn away but still there in certain vowels. He'd appeared in the high country around 1860, which meant he'd been up there through the war years without coming down, which told you either that he'd made a deliberate choice to stay out of it, or that the mountains had become his world, and the war had simply not reached him. I didn't know which, I still don't. He came down the canyon road that Friday morning and turned onto the main street and stopped. He stopped because the street was not empty. The council session was supposed to be inside the town hall, which was really just the back room of the saloon, which had a table and some chairs and was used for town business, but it had moved outside. I don't know if that was planned or if it just happened organically, the way these things do, because more people wanted to attend than the back room could hold. By the time I got there, I'd been delayed by a horse that had gotten loose from the livery and decided to explore the south end of town. The crowd was already in the street. 60 or 70 people, maybe more. The morning sun was still at a low angle and the shadows were long and everything was backlit with that clear post-storm light that makes everything look very real and very sharp. Nora was there. She had come. Of course she had. She was standing in the middle of the street because that's where there was space, the crowd having filled the boardwalks and the edges. She had her good dress on, which she didn't usually wear on weekdays, and her hair was pinned more carefully than usual. She was holding herself very still. Emmett Hartley was speaking. He was in full form, the measured voice, the public posture, the language of a man who has convinced himself he is doing something difficult for the common good. He was talking about the community's right to choose who teaches its children. He was talking about trust. He was talking about how certain questions remained unanswered, and how he didn't think the community needed to wait for those questions to fester when a simple resolution was available. The simple resolution, it was becoming clear, was for Nora Vess to leave town. I pushed through to the front. "Emmett," I said, "this isn't the council session we agreed on." "It's a community conversation," he said. "Everyone is welcome." "Conversations don't usually happen in the middle of the road with 70 people, I said. "Sometimes they do," said Rufus Dane, and there was a laugh from somewhere in the crowd, not a nice laugh. I looked at the crowd. I saw the faces. Some of them were uncomfortable, I could see that. Some people who were there had not made a decision, but had been swept along by the momentum and weren't sure how to step back. But there were others who had made a decision, who had fixed their faces into the particular expression of righteous grievance, and those people were the core of it and the others were their weight. I said, "Miss Vess has done nothing wrong. There is no evidence of any wrongdoing. I've reviewed everything. The stories about her previous post are unverifiable rumors. The story about Tommy Pullen is false. His mother has said so. The letter from Denver is." "Deputy Hatch," this was Emmett, very calm, "no one is accusing Miss Vess of a crime." "Then what are you accusing her of?" "We're expressing a feeling," he said, "a community feeling." "A feeling," I said. "That she may not be the right fit," he said, "for our community, for our children." And the crowd murmured in support, because feeling and fit and our children were the right words, and Emmett knew how to use the right words. I looked at Nora. She was looking at me with those gray-green eyes, and her expression was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that was aware of what was about to happen. And I didn't know what to do. I'm telling you honestly. I was the deputy. I had authority, technically. But authority requires cooperation, and the cooperation of this crowd was not available to me in that moment. It was in that moment that Harlan Cade walked out of the crowd. Not through the crowd, he was standing at the back of it, just arrived, and I don't think he fully understood what he was walking into. I think he came down from the canyon road, saw the crowd, walked up to see what was happening, listened for 30 seconds and made a decision. He just walked through the crowd. Not aggressively, not pushing people out of the way. Just walking with the steady certainty of a man who is going somewhere, and has decided that things in the way of his going somewhere will move. And they moved, people stepping back as he passed, half because of his size and half because of something in the way he carried himself that suggested he was not calculating his options right now. He had already calculated them and was in the middle of executing. He walked to the center of the street. He stopped next to Nora Vess. He didn't touch her. He didn't put his arm around her or make any protective gesture. He just stood there next to her in the middle of the street and faced the crowd. The crowd went quiet. I mean really quiet. Not the quiet of a crowd that's been hushed, but the quiet of a crowd that has been genuinely surprised, that has encountered something it hadn't accounted for, and needs a moment to recalculate. Harlan Cade looked at Emmett Hartley. He said, "What's happening here?" Emmett blinked. He was not used to being spoken to in that particular tone, which was not aggressive and not polite, which was simply direct in the way that a man who has spent 5 years talking mostly to himself is direct when he decides to speak, stripped of all social decorating, just the question. "Mr. Cade," Emmett said, recovering, "this is a town matter." "I'm in the town," Harlan said. "What's happening?" "We're having a discussion about the school teacher." Harlan looked at Nora. A look that lasted maybe 3 seconds, which is a long time for a look. Then he looked back at Emmett. "Looks more like 60 people standing around one woman," he said. "I assure you it's—" "What did she do?" Emmett began to explain. The community trust, the unanswered questions, the feeling. "What did she do?" Harlan said again. Not louder, just more specifically. Emmett faltered. "As I said, it's not a matter of specific." "Did she steal something?" "No, of course." "Did she hurt someone?" The question of the Pullen boy. "His mother said it was a fence," I said loudly. "I'm saying it publicly. His mother, who was there, said the boy fell off a fence. That's the record." Silence. Harlan looked at Emmett. "Did she hurt someone?" Emmett's jaw moved. "Not as such, no. But the community's confidence." "Did she do her job?" A pause. "That's a matter of." "Did the children learn things?" Another pause, longer. "The question of methodology," Emmett began. From somewhere in the crowd, I couldn't see who, and I never found out, a voice said, "Yeah, Emmett. Did the kids learn things?" That was the sound I'd been waiting for. That one voice from inside the crowd asking the question sideways. Because a crowd isn't one thing. It's a lot of people, and most of them are following the strongest current, and if you can change the current, even slightly, the crowd can change. Harlan Cade wasn't done. He said, "I've been in these mountains 5 years. I come down here 3 times a year. I've met most of you." He paused. His voice was unhurried. "I don't have much to say, usually. It's not my business, but I know what I'm looking at right now." Nobody spoke. 60-some people in a street, he said. One woman standing in the middle of it, and the best reason anybody's got for why she needs to go is a feeling. He said the word the same way I'd said it, flatly, as if the word, examined directly, had less substance than it had seemed to. "She hasn't done anything wrong," he said. "She's teaching children. She corrected a boy who cheated." He didn't look at Emmett when he said that last part, but Emmett's face did something that told me Harlan knew exactly what had started this. "And now there's 60 people in the street." He looked at the crowd, moved his eyes slowly from one side to the other. "I don't know most of your names," he said. "But I'm thinking, and feel free to correct me, I'm thinking that most of you came out here this morning because Emmett Hartley or somebody like him, said there was a problem, and you trusted that there was a problem. And now you're standing here looking at a woman who did her job, and you're trying to decide if that's enough reason to make her leave. The crowd was very still. It's not, he said. He said it simply, without drama, like it was the conclusion to an arithmetic problem. It's not enough reason, he said, and I think most of you know it. I think most of you knew it before you came out here this morning, but it's easier to walk toward something than to turn around and walk back. He stopped talking. The silence lasted long enough that the wind picked up slightly, and dust moved on the street, and somewhere a horse shifted its weight at the livery, and the sound of it carried in the quiet. Then Harlan Cade said, looking at Emmett Hartley, "Is there anything else you want to discuss?" Emmett looked at him. Emmett was not a stupid man, and he was not a coward exactly, but he was a man who had calculated things all his life, and right now his calculations were not coming out in his favor, and he knew it. The crowd had shifted. Not all of it, there were still people at the edges with fixed faces, but the center of it had shifted, and without the center, the edges don't have weight. Emmett said, "This isn't finished." Harlan said, "That's your choice." And then he turned, not dramatically, not making a show of it, just turned the way a man turns when he's done with a conversation, and he said to Nora Vess, quietly but not so quietly that the nearest people couldn't hear, "You all right, ma'am?" And Nora Vess, who had held herself completely still through everything, whose voice had not broken and whose eyes had not filled even when I'd thought they might, looked at this man she had never met in her life and said, "I am now, thank you." And that was that. Resolution. The crowd dispersed. Not all at once, it doesn't work that way. People don't vanish. They drift in groups of 2 and 3, talking to each other in lowered voices, and you can watch the momentum drain out of the thing like water out of a cracked vessel, slow and then gone. Emmett Hartley and his brother and Donovan Quill walked back toward the saloon without looking at anyone. Rufus Dane stood at the edge of things for a while with his arms crossed, like he was deciding whether there was still something to be in front of, and then decided there wasn't, and left. I stood next to Nora for a few minutes. I asked her again if she was all right. She said yes. I believed her more than I'd believed her the first time. Harlan Cade was still there. He'd stepped back from the center of the street and was standing at the edge, near the dry goods store, watching the crowd drain away with the expression of a man who has done a thing and is now satisfied that it's done. I walked over to him. I said, "That was something, Mr. Cade." He looked at me, then at the dispersing crowd, then back at me. "It wasn't much," he said. "It was enough," I said. He seemed to consider that. Then he nodded once, the way men from the mountains nod, a single deliberate movement, meaning yes, accepting the information. "She going to be all right?" he said. "I think so," I said. "You want to meet her?" He looked over at Nora, who was talking to a woman named Sarah Glennies, one of the few women in town who'd stayed consistently friendly to her. He looked for a moment and then he said, "No, I don't think I need to." I didn't push it. Some people don't need things formalized. He bought his supplies from Quill's store. Quill served him with the manner of a man trying very hard to be normal, and he had a drink at the saloon, a single drink, and by early afternoon he was gone, back up the canyon road, the pack on his back and the rifle on his sling and his long stride eating up the rocky ground. I watched him go. The Friday council session happened that afternoon, inside the back room of the saloon, properly this time, with all 5 council members present. I spoke, I laid out everything. The story about the Nevada Post, unverifiable, no source. The Tommy Pullen Bruise, Mrs. Pullen herself, Tommy's mother, was present and said her piece clearly and without equivocation. The concerns about the letter from Denver, I proposed that we write directly to the ministry and wait for a response before making any decisions, and this was agreed. Nora spoke. She was measured and clear and did not apologize for anything she hadn't done, and she did not pretend to feelings she didn't have, and she was more impressive than she'd been in the street, because in the street she'd been holding on, and in the council room she was advancing. The council voted to continue the arrangement with Miss Vess until the response from Denver was received, and to revisit only if the response gave cause. The response from Denver came 3 weeks later. It confirmed everything in her letter, added a personal commendation from the minister who'd written it, and noted that Miss Vess had declined a post in a larger town in order to take the posting in Redrock, because she felt smaller communities needed qualified teachers more. Emmett Hartley was not present when the letter was read publicly. He had other things to attend to. Nora Vess stayed in Redrock Gulch for 4 more years. She taught something like 30 children in those 4 years, and she was good at it in the particular way that the best teachers are good, not just instruction but something larger, the communication of the idea that the world is knowable and that knowing it is worth the effort. I saw it in the kids who came through her class. They held themselves differently afterward. They asked questions differently. They had an expectation that questions would be answered, that answers were available, that the gap between not knowing and knowing was crossable. Tommy Pullen, who'd had the bruise from the fence post, became her most devoted student. He went on to a school in Denver when he was 15, and last I heard he was working for a newspaper somewhere in the East. Bess Fremont, who Clemson had copied from, became the first woman in the county to hold a land deed in her own name, which she did at age 19. Clemson Hartley, for what it's worth, improved considerably at arithmetic once he stopped having someone else do it for him. After 4 years, Nora accepted a post in Denver. A larger school, better resources, the opportunity to train other teachers. She left on the supply wagon the same way she'd arrived, and I went to see her off. She shook my hand. She said, "You did more than you think you did." I said, "Not enough that day." She looked at me. "You stayed," she said, "when it would have been easier not to, that counts." I wanted to say something about Harlan Cade, about how it had really been him, standing there, saying what nobody else had said, but she spoke first. "I thought about him a lot," she said. "The mountain man, I never even learned his name." "Harlan Cade," I said. She repeated it quietly, testing the sound of it. "I thought about what it took," she said, "to walk through all those people. He didn't know me at all. I was a stranger." "Some people don't need to know you," I said. "They just look at what's happening and decide what side they're on." She nodded. The wagon driver was getting impatient with the delay. She climbed up to the seat. "I hope he's all right," she said, "up in those mountains." "I think men like that are generally all right," I said. The wagon went. I stood in the street for a while after it was gone. I saw Harlan Cade twice more after that day. Once was about 8 months later when he came down for his winter supplies. We nodded at each other on the street. That was the extent of it. I thought about saying something about Nora, about how she'd stayed 4 years, about how it had worked out. But somehow saying it seemed like putting a frame around something that didn't need one. The second time was in the spring of 1868, which was the last time I saw him at all, because after that the word was that he had gone further up into the high country, past the usual trapper's territory, past the routes that anyone followed regularly, into the truly empty places where the peaks were unnamed, and the passes were known only to people who had lived in those mountains long enough to make their own maps. That spring he came in for supplies in the usual way. I was outside the deputy's office. He came past. He slowed. He said, "The teacher, she's still here." "Moved on," I said. "Denver, good situation." He nodded. He started to walk. Then he stopped. "Did it work out," he said, "for her after that day?" "Yes," I said. "It worked out 4 good years. She helped a lot of kids." He nodded again, that single deliberate nod. Good, he said. And he went to get his supplies, and I watched him, and I thought about what it takes to be the kind of person who walks through a crowd. Not the kind of person who's fearless. I don't think he was fearless. I think he felt what everyone feels, the pull of the crowd's opinion, the desire to keep your head down and let what's happening happen, and not make yourself the center of it. I think he felt that, and then he walked through the crowd anyway. Because he looked at what was happening and decided what side he was on. Ending line. I've told this story a few times over the years, not many times. It's not the kind of story that fits easily into casual conversation, and there's a part of it that makes people uncomfortable. Not the part about the crowd turning on Nora, which people can place as a past mistake and file under things we don't do anymore, but the part about how easy it was, how it built from a single disagreement about a boy cheating on an arithmetic test. How the town let it build and fed it and went along with it, and then stood in the street with the momentum of it, and needed one quiet man from the mountains to ask the right question before the current changed. That part makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't feel like history. It feels like something that could happen on a Tuesday morning, given the right conditions and the wrong silence. I'm 63 years old. I've been in this valley most of my life. I've seen good things happen here, and I've seen bad things happen here, and I've learned that the difference between them is usually not the presence of bad people and the absence of good ones. It's usually the presence or absence of someone willing to walk through the crowd and stand next to the one person standing alone. That's all it takes sometimes. Just stand there, just be counted. The rest usually follows.